Thank you, Bishop Hiles. Thank you for inviting me. I was very grateful to Bishop Hiles for contacting me several weeks ago and telling me that my friend Rod was going to be here, and then more recently asking me to conduct this panel. And as I told him when he sent me a flyer for the panel, I put it up on the bulletin board at Thomas More College in New Hampshire, where I'm teaching. But it's not a very good date because 75% of the students there are on a pilgrimage this weekend to the Shrine of the North American Martyrs. And I mention this just because, Rod, you need to get there sometime. You would find Thomas More College is a little bit like a monastery, not in the sense that the students are planning monastic life. Most of them won't. Some of them will. But in the sense that it is a learning community with people dedicated during their time there to a sort of monastic existence. I'm not here to give any more pitch. I'll stop now. I'm also grateful to Bishop Hiles for putting me here and putting Rod on my right. Ordinarily, when I'm invited to a panel, I'm on the extreme right. And I'm reminded once, years ago, I ran into the late Father Richard John Newhouse, and he said, "Oh, Phil, I was just quoting you." And I was flattered, and I said, "Oh, what were you quoting me as saying?" I thought one of the brilliant things that I'd written recently, and he said, "Oh, I was talking to somebody, and I said, Phil Lawler, if you're to the right of Phil Lawler, you're a real winger." So, there you are.
I do what I can.
Why don't I let you take the first shot at the responses today?
Oh, okay. Well, can you hear me on the mic? I have a... Can you hear that? All right, we'll try this one then. Turn this off. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for your responses. A writer, the best a writer can hope for is that his words will be taken seriously, not even necessarily approved of, but taken seriously. And so you all have paid me a great compliment by doing so, and I thank you for that. I made some notes as you taught, so I'll go along in order. Father Burns, I thank you for what you had to say about education. And it made me, one of the notes I took was wondering what are the challenges within the church, within the Catholic Church, but also within the church itself, regarding education, something maybe we can get into later. But I watch the Catholic world well enough to know that not all the hierarchy or the institutions of the church are on board with an authentic, ex corde ecclesiae Catholic education. And so I don't want to put you on the spot for that, but I do wonder if as somebody whose kids go to a classical Christian school and whose headmaster is an Anglican priest who wants to bring the local churches in our city into a relationship, an active, ongoing relationship with the school and the students, I don't know how far he's gotten with that, because I really don't know if even the local churches have their heads in the game in terms of using education to form Christian students holistically. But I'm glad you're one of the ones who's trying to do that. I'm also reminded that by your example, you show the importance of elites in reforming the church and reigniting the fire of faith within people. I think that all of us can look and see how elites and all the churches have failed in many ways, and in other institutions in society. But you show why it's important to have real believers, committed believers, who work through the institutions to renew those institutions. So thank you for that. Archbishop Haviland, about the post-Christian culture, I just want to clarify for our audience today, when I say that we live in a post-Christian culture, it's not a comment about the quality of the faith necessarily. I agree with you, there was never a utopian age, a golden age of faith, not even the 1950s. But my comment has to do with the general understanding, a cultural understanding we have of reality, of who we are, of what story, what narrative explains the world to us. In this culture, we have lived through Christendom already. I agree that in some ways we are pre-Christian because we've never really fully converted the culture. But we have also, in the West at least, lived through Christianity. Our young people think that they've heard it all before. They're not like the pagans in Europe who received the first evangelist. And so that makes the challenge even greater. I think C.S. Lewis may have said that it's easier to evangelize real pagans because they believe in the transcendent. They believe in the world of the spirit. But people who have ceased to believe in the transcendent, their hearts are hard as stone. And I think in this sense, we are in a post-Christian culture. As far as the solution goes, as you know, I don't offer a firm solution because I'm still trying to figure it out myself. And I meant it sincerely when I say that we need each other. We need to be in dialogue with each other and learn from each other. I particularly appreciated Bishop Matawiki's comments on this because we Christians in the West have lost something important that our African brothers and sisters have not yet lost. And so we can look to them for advice, for fellowship, for sustenance. And maybe we can give them something too because we have lived through something that they're just now starting to get in a serious way. I think the faith, though, is a solution in the sense that it teaches us how to endure. If Christians are looking for a solution that's going to make the problems of modernity go away, I don't think they're going to find it in Christianity, because we are going to be struggling to live in this world until our Lord returns, struggling to live as to be wheat among the tares. But if the Benedict option works, if people adopt it, it will give a sense of meaning to that struggle and a direction for that struggle, and give us the means spiritually, morally, and communally to be faithful in persecution, if it comes to that. About the Global South, I wrote this book, as I said, for Christians in the West, and I don't really know a lot about the particular challenges of the Global South. I do know from what I've heard people say that in Africa, for example, people are much more aware of the world of spirit, that this is a real thing, not just spiritual warfare, but God being present in the spirit in a very palpable way among the people. And I think that fundamentally changes or it renders the challenges that the church faces in Africa different. It's different from what we face here. But as I said, that's why I think we have a lot to learn from the Global South. I thought one of the best points she made, and this is one that I struggle with myself, was talking about the pain of an alternative to secularization. I remember when I was first becoming a Christian in my 20s, I met a Catholic priest in Baton Rouge, where I was living. This was a Belgian Catholic priest who had been working in Baton Rouge since the 1960s. He said, "You can't imagine how much better we have it now. Now Protestants and Catholics talk to each other. We meet regularly. We have fellowship." He was talking about the conditions of things in the 1960s, which was only 20 or 30 years earlier, where Protestants and Catholics in my own city barely talked to each other. They had a lot of mutual suspicion. To me, that was an alien thing, having grown up Protestant, but in a world in Louisiana where it was perfectly normal for Catholics and Protestants to talk to each other. That made me realize that little bit of historical perspective made me realize how things have gotten better in many ways. Certainly, we're starting to see a lot more fellowship across the racial divide in the Deep South than was there when I was a kid, and certainly when my parents were kids. These are all good things. But I was reminded by your comments of something that a man who was the editor of Governing Magazine said about how people today want to edit history. We all want the poetic version of the past, when we had strong families, strong, close-knit communities, things like that. But there were prices to be paid there for women who couldn't leave abusive husbands because it was against the traditions of the community. One of the reasons there were closer communities in Chicago, as this writer pointed out, is because people had to be outside on their stoops in the summertime because it was too hot inside. Nobody had air conditioning. So, and you're a Southerner too, you know that we're not going to give up our air conditioning for anything. But in a more serious way, you're right about the cost of returning to tradition. It's going to cost us something in comfort, and it's going to cause us to have to be meaner in some ways by the world standards. I think this is unavoidable, but I think you're absolutely right that this is something we have to confront. Dr. Brown, thank you so much for your comments too. When you talked about the household, what Luther said about the household standing alone for the gospel, Luther's prophecy about the future, it brought to mind something that I heard from a prominent German Catholic who I ran into in Rome last fall. We were talking about the Benedict option, and he's a younger man with a large family. He told me that we Christians in Germany, we Catholics at least, expect the institutional church to completely collapse in the next 30 years. Said there won't be anything left. There may be a few priests here and there, but if the faith is going to be carried on, he said, it's going to be in families like ours, where that are close-knit, that educate their children in the faith, form their children in a very intentional way in the faith, and marry them off to each other. He said that's the only way we could see that we're going to survive in Germany. And I thought that was a striking thing. And then when you spoke of Luther saying that, it really struck a chord in me. You asked about the denominational orthodoxies. What's the goal of larger churches in the Benedict option? I think this all depends on our ecclesiology. I mean, for me as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, I can't possibly leave the Orthodox Church. I wouldn't leave the Orthodox Church. We have to have that institution there. Catholics would feel the same way. Anglicans, it's a little bit different, as you Anglicans know. But for us, the ecclesiology means that we have to stay in the continuing historical church. That said, it's also true that the churches are in many cases husks, dry husks. Marco Sermarini, the head of the Tipolowski, this is what he was talking about. He told me that I didn't put this in the book, but he said that the priest in the parish most of them go to came to him and said, why don't you all come here and do all this in the parish? He said, I had to tell him, with respect, Father, if we stayed in the parish with our children, we were afraid they would lose the faith. Because the priest himself, they were afraid to be strong in the faith and really teach the faith because they were afraid people would go away. And so Marco and his group, they're faithful to the Catholic Church, but because they're faithful to the Catholic Church, they do everything except the sacraments outside the parish. So I think that a lot of us are going to have to develop these sort of, ad hoc strategies that are loyal to our bigger institutions, but also find a way within those institutions to keep the faith. The danger here, I think, is the risk of becoming elitist, a church within the church, and thinking that we are spiritually superior. That sort of pride is something that we have to definitely be on guard against. On the question of voluntarism and nominalism, I'm not prepared to engage on an academic level, but I would simply say that we at the ordinary pew sitter level, need to affirm intellectually and otherwise that reality is transcendent, that there is a reality beyond our own. I find that so much Christianity today, MTD Christianity, whether it's Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant, is people come from the general perspective that we can make it up as we go along, that if the church is traditionally taught that same-sex marriage is not a possibility, well, maybe the Spirit is speaking to us in a new way now, and we can reinterpret the Scripture to fit our needs today. I think that this is the danger that comes with thinking that Christianity is a disembodied thing, disembodied from all material reality, and that it's mostly an emotional thing. And I'm sure you would agree with me on that, but I may have gotten into waters deeper than I intended when I talked about nominalism in the book. On education, Christians using the things of the world. Say Basil the Great said this early on, in the patristic era, that Christians can make use of pagan text, and we shouldn't be afraid to if we go at them in the right way. You mentioned Emperor Julian the Apostate, who tried to force Christian teachers out. I think he's already here in some of our schools. In Fort Worth, Texas, a couple of years ago, the public school district was planning to compel teachers to affirm gender ideology, public school teachers. And they got a lot of pushback for parents and abandoned the plan, but that's coming. So what does a Christian teacher do if she's teaching third grade and she has to teach these lessons in gender ideology to her kids and she can't do it? She's going to have to find something else to do. I think we also see cases where academic disciplines, entire areas of scholarship, are being taken over by leftists, by these social justice warriors. Earlier this year, I believe it was, there was the meeting of the annual the Association for the Classics, teaching of Latin and Greek. They had a big controversy this year at the annual meeting in which a professor at Princeton, a scholar, said that the classics are they're two dead white male Europeans. He said, we need to liberate the classics, to queer them, to make them open to different readings, blah, 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 the usual social justice jargon. But he also called for white males to be forbidden to write papers in scholarly journals as a question of social justice. Now, when you have gotten these sort of social justice progressive norms into scholarship such that people, because they are Christian, or they're white, or they're male, or they're anybody, not allowed to be scholars and to practice their work, you've got a Julian the Apostate de facto situation there within the field, even if the state never steps in. And this is why I think the classical Christian schools, as well as colleges, that are committed to being a more traditional approach to the humanities are going to be very quickly, if they're not already, some of the only places where we can take a more traditional approach to the humanities, not just the classics, but all the humanities, without seeing them sacrificed on the altar of social justice jargon and progressivism and, as some would say, cultural Marxism. Bishop Madueke, thank you again for your comments. I was startled to hear you say that Nigeria is facing the same challenge. I was very careful, as you noted, to say in my book that I was speaking to the church in the West because I simply don't know enough about the church in the global South, as I've explained. But I was frankly thrilled to hear you say that Christians in the global South, in Africa and elsewhere, need to take up the Benedict option and see what it means for you all, and the challenges you face, because modernity is coming at you hard and fast. When you said that you see the young men in Nigeria, you don't know if they're British or American by the way some of them behave, you've got it. That's it. This stuff is coming at you too. And that's why I would love to see you or somebody or other people, other Christians in Africa, take the ideas in this book and explain how they can work in the African context. One thing that I think that we do have to learn from Africans, and I'm happy to bring this up here at this conference where we're talking about the battle in heaven. Africans, in my experience and in my reading, have so much more awareness of the reality of spiritual warfare, of the demonic. It is very hard to get Americans today to take this seriously, unless you've had direct experience of it. I mentioned that last week when I was in New York, I visited my friends, the wife of whom is struggling with a demon. This demon manifested through her when I was sitting with her. And she told me, the wife, she said, that's not me. I said, I know it's not you. And she has been struggling with the exorcist to get free of this demon. Her husband told me that once you go, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, her husband told me that when you go down this road and when you have your eyes open to the reality of spiritual warfare, you can't forget it. And you see everything, the ordinary challenges that we face in ordinary daily Christian life through different eyes. My understanding is that Africans have these eyes already, and I think that this may be one big gift that you all can give to the church in the West is to remind us of the reality of spiritual warfare. I thank you for saying that the Benedict option is a call to rebuild families in ways that lead people to God. That's exactly what I think, that the family, it has to start there. A lot of American Christians love to complain about what the bishops aren't doing, what the priests aren't doing, but they never want to look and see what they themselves as fathers and mothers aren't doing in the home. And I think that there is a prophetic call there to repent, we who are in charge of the domestic monastery. Finally, I want to thank you for talking about the prosperity gospel in Nigeria and being something that is taking Christians away from understanding that suffering is a key part of the Christian faith. You know, I was in France a couple of years ago for the launch of the French edition of the Benedict option, and I had coffee with a well-known French intellectual. He's an atheist, maybe 70 years old, and he was interested in the book. We had a mutual friend, so we stopped to talk. And he was very, very depressed about the future of his country. Even though he's an atheist, he said that we don't have anything to fight the rise of militant Islam with, and so many of our people are just going over to hedonism. They have nothing to live for except their own pleasure. And I don't know what to do. I said to him, Professor, where do you get your hope? He said, I have no hope. Just like that, I have no hope. I told him, I do have hope. My hope is in Jesus Christ. But I'm not saying that to you like an American TV evangelical. I mean that I'm not optimistic about the future. I believe that all of us in the West will have to suffer, and some of us suffer greatly for the faith. But that's what it means to be a Christian. True Christian hope is not the belief that we will never have to suffer, but it's the belief that God will not abandon us in our suffering, and that our suffering, if we unite it to Jesus Christ, has meaning. And the atheist professor looked at me and said, well, if that's what you believe, then that's good for you Americans. But here in France, we believe that this life is all there is. When you're dead, you're dead. And I thought to him, I said, then I really don't know what else I can say to this man, because suffering is meaningless in his case. But I think the true Christian hope, as we will have to rediscover as a church, involves an acceptance of suffering and letting suffering transform us into being like Christ. My friend whose wife is suffering right now through possession by a demon, he said that one thing they have learned in this journey with the exorcist is that one thing the demons absolutely hate is when you are willing to suffer for Christ. He told me that he has offered up all of his suffering to join it to Christ, and he said, I thank God for the suffering I'm given, because it gives me a deep connection to our Lord and his passion and death and his resurrection. So only if we learn how to suffer faithfully will we be resurrected. And I think that's about all I have for the comments. I want to thank you all again for what you had to say. You've given me a lot to think about.
Before I let go of the microphone, Rod, I wanted to tease a few more thoughts out of you on a subject that you just mentioned. You said the subject being, how does those who take the Benedict option, and I think there are actually quite a lot who already have before it was given a name, how do we relate to the institutional church? How does the domestic church relate to the institutional church? And you mentioned that in some cases the parish or the diocese or whatever is a husk. Well, in some cases it's worse than a husk. In some cases it's actually hostile. And you can disagree if you want, but
you know I'm not going to disagree.
In some cases, when you try to do something that is truly evangelical, you have not just discouragement, but active opposition from the institution. How do you deal with that? But then the flip side, sometimes the institution, yes, it is a husk. The parish, where you have some people who get it and a great number of people who don't. How do you relate to those people? I don't want to leave them behind. I want to bring them along on the journey.
Very difficult questions, Phil. And you know, you and I have labored in the fields of journalism and journalism about the church for a long time, and we know how weak and corrupt so many parts of the churches are. I think that to answer your second question first, in terms of leaving people behind, it's a delicate thing, you know, because you want to be able to be a good example to those who are suffering and to let them know that they're not being left alone in their suffering. If you can show them compassion and show them a better way to live, then that's why you need to be there, because if they don't learn it from you and your walk with Christ and your family's walk with Christ, where are they going to learn it? On the other hand, there comes a time, and some of my Episcopalian friends have gone through this in their own churches. That's why they're no longer Episcopalian. They're either continuing Anglican, or some cases become evangelical or Catholic. Some have become Orthodox. There comes a time when you have to walk away, when a church itself and a congregation is determined not to follow its Lord. And I think that is a matter of discernment. We all know the stereotype of the person who says, if this church does one more thing, I'm out the door, and that one more thing never comes because people are afraid to leave. There are some people who will stand firm because they believe they're called to make a witness, and I don't want to take away from them, I want to build them up. But there's some people who don't want to leave because they're afraid. You know, they're afraid of what life would be like if they got out of that church. I think there's no surefire formula for determining which one is which. I think about what to do when the church itself, when the institution is against what you're trying to do evangelically or otherwise. That's a tough one, because I come out of a tradition where obedience, and so do you, where obedience is a big thing. It's important to be obedient, but I think it's important also to not be obedient to a prelate or a priest who is telling you to do something that is objectively wrong, or trying to tear down something that is objectively right by the teachings of the church. I think it would have to depend on each particular situation, the advice I would give, but I would give people I would encourage people to persevere, because if you, in these cases, and try to do what you believe is right and what you have discerned is right through prayer and talking with other people in the faith whom you take seriously, persevere, because some of these false shepherds and false teachers are going to lead us, or are leading us into the ditch, and are destroying the church. It could be that God has called you to found something or do something, like in homeschooling, for example, or a classical Christian school, or some other ministry. Maybe this is going to be the only lifeline to keep the faith alive in your diocese or in your parish. It should always be a heavy matter, a matter of heavy discernment for a Christian to go against what his bishop or his pastor is saying. But I would not rule it out, not in this faithless era. Maybe you could give us, from your own experience, some wisdom on that, because I frankly have never had to face that myself in any serious way.
All I can say is to reaffirm that you pay a price. You have to be willing to pay a price. I was talking earlier about how when we were living in Boston, close to Boston, my family would drive every Sunday past approximately 12 Catholic churches to get to a church where we felt we were spiritually nourished, which was, by the way, the Anglican Catholic congregation. We're not Anglicans, but we were nourished there. I think you have to pay a price. Now I'm in a parish where there's a very, very strong core of very committed Catholics, mostly homeschoolers, and then there are an awful lot of other people who are just not on our wavelength. It's friendly, but it's not a real, there are two communities there. It's a problem.
Yeah, can I say one hard lesson I learned is, if you have a good parish, don't leave it if you can possibly help it. And what I mean specifically is, when we were in Dallas, we found, after my wife and I, after having been spiritually quite broken by the scandal in the Catholic Church, we washed up in an Orthodox church, OCA, the cathedral there, and it was a beautiful parish that rebuilt us and sustained us, and we loved it. I was offered very good job in Philadelphia, that one that I felt like I couldn't turn down. And we moved to Philadelphia because we thought there are Orthodox churches everywhere there. Surely we can find a good one. We have never found a church that was able to replace what we left behind in Dallas. I didn't have to move from Dallas. I moved because it was a job that paid a lot more money, and I thought it offered more security. As it turned out, it didn't offer any security at all. But the price we paid in losing a church home was a price I'll never make my wife and my kids pay again. So if you have a good parish, don't give it up quickly. Anybody else want to talk about it? No.
Well, I just wanted to respond to what you had mentioned about higher education, since that's my area. And I would say that a couple things. One is with Ex Corde in the Catholic Church, at least, it is a document that still has yet to be implemented basically in many Catholic colleges and universities. So Ex Corde Ecclesiae is a document that Pope John Paul II wrote in regard to, it's an encyclical about higher education, and really asking to look at how to reform Catholic higher education and being more faithful, more Christ-centered really, being more faithful to the church and to understanding of how, thinking with the mind of the church really, and that the university comes out of the heart of the church, and so therefore there should be some sympathy between the two, and more than sympathy, but actually a strong bond, since so many Catholic universities and colleges had kind of, if you will, dissipated from that base. And so with that, the document comes out, and I think a lot of people were anxious about it because they didn't know what it meant. Some presumed that it might mean they'd have to change what they were doing. And I think what ended up happening in a lot of ways is it was, at least in America, it was contrasted with another document that had really no official church standing, the Land O'Lakes document, which was another document that came out, I think, in the late 60s. And it was really saying that Catholic universities need to be freed from any strictures, including ecclesiastical ones. And so that kind of opened up boards of trustees to be universities and colleges to be lay run and so forth. But without getting into a history lesson about all that, I think that Ex Corde needs to be examined in the light of how could it actually be implemented, or at least taken seriously. That might be a first step. The other thing that it just strikes me is the role of evangelization on Catholic colleges, campuses. Recently I was at a talk given to the priests of the diocese that I happen to be in Minnesota, by a priest from Detroit, Father John, and he runs this ministry called Acts 29, and it's really about how to move in essentially parishes, but this was to a group of priests, into really falling in love again with Christ and all that means, being redeemed, recaptured, reclaimed, and so forth. But one of the stories he told was a young Catholic woman who had just been through Catholic college, and they had a chance to talk to one another, and how she just broke down in tears because the way he was explaining who Christ really is, she said, no one's ever said that before. No one's ever kind of explained it that way before. And so it's another place where I think it reemphasizes the fact that the university culture, at least in the Catholic tradition, should be a place where students are falling in love with Christ. I think then you get an organic kind of that re-evangelization is organically building up the church, the community from the student level. And it's complemented, hopefully, by the professoriate and the administration working together, at least a substantial part of them working together. And I think that will lead to more kind of radical transformation in the positive sense of the Catholic colleges and universities. And I think there are some that are doing that already within the strictures that they face, Thomas More being one, and some other ones. But I think to your point, I think there's a ways to go in that, and yet we, I think, have to continue to take up the mantle and go forward with that.
Yeah, let me quickly respond. I think parents and lay Catholics and Christians of all kinds need to wake up and understand that you cannot necessarily trust the institutions. I was thinking about a Catholic college I went to. I'll tell you which one later. But I gave a talk there 2 or 3 years ago, and the I talked to one of the professors there, a theologian. He said, I cannot even quote the catechism in my class, because if I go against anything LGBT, then I will be reported to the administration of this Catholic college, and I won't get tenure. And other professors there affirmed, yes, this is what's going on there. I said, you couldn't even quote what Pope Francis said? I said, no, I couldn't do it. And they went on to tell me that a lot of parents, this college has been around for a while, a lot of parents, Catholic parents, send their kids there because the college puts on a great facade that Catholic education, but in fact, they're being educated away from their faith there. And, but people don't want to have to think about this. They want to think that they can trust the institutions that always were there, and they don't see that this spiritual battle that we've been talking about is going on right down the middle of almost every Christian institution. And we lay Christians need to take this seriously, strengthen those within the institutions who are fighting the good fight, but also not be taken in by those who want to take advantage of our natural trust in the institutions.
I think on both decisions involving employment and college attendance, finding a good parish or a good institution that has a good parish nearby is key. And if you don't have that, then don't make the change. You should assume it's a wrong move. In terms of paying the price, this parish, our host parish, and the then Father Hiles are a model. People who were locked out, literally locked out of their church by a heretical bishop, and who were not desirous of being disobedient. They immediately found a bishop to come and lead them and rebuild. And if you're in an Episcopally ordered church, you can't leave episcopacy, and you can't leave the church in a broad sense, but you can walk away from a heretical bishop, and the ecumenical councils say, if your bishop becomes heretical or schismatic, find the closest Orthodox bishop and submit to him. And this parish did, and here we are.
Dr. Brown, I'd like to get you to say a little bit more about two things that you said that resonated with me. One was your emphasis on the family, which is, in a way, the ultimate minority group, the ultimate splinter group, and the need to protect it, because you are, by definition, your family is the only one that's your family. And the other is, I think you were the one who made the comment that we need to convince the state to be just the state. To convince the state to be just the state. Okay. And that strikes me as a very big challenge today, where the state wants to play more and more of a role doing what the family has traditionally done.
Here in Massachusetts, really?
Yes.
Yep. Well, beginning with the second point, that for Christians to think of themselves as reminding the state to be just the state, I think has as much application for Christians in thinking about themselves and their responsibility as it does as a program for successful modification of what the state is doing, that it is a reminder that our purpose is not necessarily to convert the state into the city of God, that it still has a role, and I think as with the idea that academic institutions or cultural institutions can, in a sense, despite themselves, preserve elements of Christian tradition, that the state, under God's providence, does fulfill good and divinely appointed purposes despite itself, right? That despite its efforts to, essentially, do the devil's work, that it still remains under God's hand, and when it restrains evildoers, it's doing something which God wants done by the state, and Christians should acknowledge that. But I think the formulation that the state can create space, but it can't provide meaning is tremendously helpful. Again, particularly as a reminder to Christians that they shouldn't expect to get meaning from the state. And that when the state attempts to do so, as of course it will, that Christians are entitled in conscience to ignore it. Right? There are many things that St. Paul says that the Christian has to obey the powers that be, not just because of punishment, but for the sake of conscience. But I think that it's important to recognize that there are boundaries, right, to Christian responsibility to the state, and that's, I think, a good way of articulating it when the state tries to provide meaning rather than providing space. The family, again, it needs to be protected, but I think it's also important to see it as being protective, right, as a bulwark as well as something that requires defense, and that both are true, and not to underestimate its power to act in that way, again, as something which has been established by God. I mean, it's not a human invention, but a divine ordinance, and as the place where God's word is preached, taught, passed on, where the tradition is conveyed, even when the other powers in the world fail to do so or openly seek to prevent it from being done. I think that was Luther's vision of the family, the household in the last days, where he believed he was living, and where I think we may have an apocalyptic sense of living as well. And I think that sense is salutary.
Would anyone in the audience like to raise a question?
My name is Connor Wood. This question is generally directed at Dr. Brown, but I'd like to hear everybody's thoughts about this. I think it's true that we're not supposed to be deriving meaning from the state, and that the state is overreaching when it tries to become a meaning-generating institution. But what about the nation? I think that there's a real tension in the Benedict option discourse that has been really challenging for me as an American, because I do both love this country and find it to be my home. It informs my mores, my tastes, my history, the way I see the world. We are these particular creatures placed in nations, right? That's just how God creates us. And I love my home. But it's also starting to feel like I can't participate fully in it, just as Rod is saying. It's starting to feel like Babylon.